We have present Councillors Allison, Anderson, Brown, Carmichael, Chalmers. We have apologies from Councillor Clark and Councillor Johnson Dempsey as substituting. We have apologies from Councillor Convery and Councillor Handybode as substituting. Don't see Councillor Cooper in the meeting at the moment. We also have present Councillors Cowan, Devlin, Fagan, Ferguson Miller, Frame, Hamilton, Kerr, Logan, Loudon, McAllen, McClymont, McCreary, Leslie MacDonald, McLachlan, Nelson, Ray. We have apologies from Councillor Razak and Councillor Cowie substituting. And we have present Councillors Robb, Ross, Shearer and Walker. And I'll hand back to the Chair. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can I come to item 1, which are declarations of interest? Are there any declarations of interest? I don't see any declarations of interest, so can we come to item 2, which are the minutes of the previous meeting? Are there any questions on the minutes of the previous meeting? There are none, so can we approve those minutes as a correct record? Are we agreed? Agreed. To come now to item 3, which is the revenue budget monitoring paper, and I will come to Jackie Taylor to speak to that paper. Jackie.
Thank you, Chair. This is our revenue monitoring report taking us to the 30th of December. As is usually the case at this point in the year, this includes our probable outturn position. So this is our estimate of where we will finish the year financially. The report includes an executive summary at section 4, which I'll focus on for today. I'm also providing an update on the settlement that we had in December, the part that relates to the current financial year, and also an update on our housing revenue account position. So if I can take you to section 4 of the report, this is the executive summary for our probable outturn for the year. Full details are provided in section 5 of the report for your information. The report itself focuses on the outturn position that's summarised in table 1 of the report for you on page 16. This is reporting that we are seeing an initial underspend of £18.7 million. This is before new proposed transfers to reserves that members will be asked to approve. Table 1 shows that outturn is over 4 main areas: our resource position, loan charges, corporate items and council tax, and I'll go through those in a second. There are proposed transfers to reserves, as I mentioned. They're in that table as well. They total £4.9 million, which leaves us with a position after transfers to reserves of 13.7. I would say at this stage that almost all of the figures that you can see in here have been reported before around that position after transfers to reserves of £13.7 million. It's only marginally different from what I've reported back in November. So if I take each of those areas, they're starting at section 4.4 with our resource position. We are reporting a combined break-even position for our resources, and that includes proposed transfers to reserves of £3.2 million. We've included in Appendix 2 of the report on page 26 the details of those proposed transfers to reserves for members' consideration. And you can see there from section 4.5 through to 4.8, each of the resources are reporting a break-even position after those transfers to reserves. The position for social work is picked up at 4.9. That's slightly different to the way we've presented the other resources, and that just reflects the fact that we have our delegated budget to the IGB. What we're reporting for social work, the delegated budget to IGB is that we have a proposed transfer to reserves for some committed repair works across social work properties, but it also includes £650,000 in relation to the delegated budget. That's effectively an underspend on that budget. As we've reported in previous years, the Council could have retained that money because it effectively represents an overfunding to the IGB. But again, in line with what we've done in recent years, we are proposing that these monies can be retained by the IGB and to be used in future years to help with their pressures. 4.10 picks up the social work position for our non-delegated services, which includes children and families. The position includes a transfer to reserves for the residual pressures in relation to children and families, particularly around residential placements and fostering and kinship care. Social Work Resources Committee get an update every meeting on their budget recovery plan, and this transfer to reserves is part of that plan. 411 just reminds members that the Appendix 2 on page 26 includes all of those proposed transfers to reserves. The second part of the probable outturn was loan charges, and that's covered at 412. An in-year underspend of £7.9 million is anticipated from Loans Fund. That's a marginal increase from the figure I reported back in November, an increase of £661,000. It's mainly due just to the timing of capital spend and when we borrow and the interest rates that were assumed within our borrowing. In November, we recommended that the underspend around loans fund could be used to support our budget going forward as part of our loans fund review. At 413, corporate items are picked up. Again, the majority of the underspend in this item have been reported back in November to Executive Committee, and that was mainly from an underspend expected in utilities of £2 million. The underspend is now £2.5 million, and that includes underspend in relation to procurement savings that we've managed to achieve early. So that £520,000 adds to that utilities underspend that I'd previously reported. 416 picks up council tax and council tax reduction scheme. I had reported back in November that we were expecting a better position for council tax and our council tax reduction scheme of £3.3 million. That position remains in this outturn. So in terms of our summary at 417, I am reporting that there's an overall underspend of £13.7 million after the proposed transfer to reserves. As I've mentioned, a majority of that underspend has already been reported to committee as part of our paper in November that pointed towards how our 25-26 budget could be considered, and that was in relation to loans fund, utilities and council tax. So we now have a marginal increase in that position that I reported in relation to our loan charges, which is £660,000 more than I had previously reported, and around that procurement saving of £520,000 that I'd reported. Section 5 of the report just provides more information on each of those lines for your information. And then Section 6 of the report picks up information we received as part of our settlement in December that augments our 24-25 budget. These are areas that we have included now within our budget. They include the Scottish Welfare Fund. Additional funding of £1.2 million was provided for Scottish Welfare Fund. We will be able to spend around we'll be able to spend some of that this year, but we are proposing that £750,000 of that is transferred to reserves to allow us to use that next year. We also received notification of funding in relation to the Ukraine refugees, £218,000, and money in relation to our teachers' induction scheme, £1.8 million that had been expected. Finally, over the page on page 23, we were notified as part of that settlement that we had received our share of the funding that had been held back for maintenance of teacher numbers. So that was £9.379 million. Section 7 of the report just picks up on the housing revenue account position. Appendix 4 shows the forecast position for the housing revenue account being a break-even position. So if I can take you back to Section 2 of the report and the recommendations, we're asking that the previously approved transfer to reserves are noted, that the Council's outturn position of an underspend of £13.7 million be noted, that the proposed transfer to reserves of £4.963 million that are included in Appendix 2 be approved, that the non-recurring underspend of £650,000 in relation to the delegated budget to the IGB be held in reserves for their future years be approved, that the use of the £7.9 million underspend in relation to loans fund be transferred to reserves to support the budget strategy be approved, that the proposed use of £5.82 million underspend, and that's from utilities, procurement and council tax, be transferred to reserves to support the budget strategy be approved, and that the redeterminations of the 24-25 revenue grant funding as advised in the local government circular be noted, and finally that the projected break-even position for the housing revenue account be noted. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Jackie. Can I ask if there are any questions on that report? And could I come to John Ross?
Yes, thanks very much, Joe, and thanks, Jackie, for that report. Can I possibly draw your attention to 2.1 and in particular Section 5, the proposed use of the £7.907 million? I would like to move that we use the same wording as is in Section 6, that the amount be transferred to reserves to support the budget strategy which could include 2526 revenue budget. And my reasons for this are that this would give us greater flexibility and allow us to look at both this and presumably at the end of the day a lower council tax. When you look at the actual money we have available and how we're going to have to use that money to protect ourselves against a number of unknowns, I think this 7.907 would allow us that greater flexibility to be able to help our constituents over the coming year, and I would move accordingly.
Okay. I'll ask you if you've got a seconder, and then I'll pick up the issue, and then I'll pick up some of the other questions and come back to that. Do you have a seconder? Councillor Chalmers. Okay, and just to clarify, your proposed wording would be that the proposed use of the 7.907 million underspend from the Loans Fund review be transferred to the reserves to support the budget strategy, which could include 2025-26, as opposed to 27, 28, 29, 30.
That's correct,
okay.
Joe.
Right, okay. Can I just see, are there any response to that from officials before I kind of come back to it and then go through the rest of the other questions? Jackie.
Thank you. In relation to that recommendation, I would point out that, as I've reported in the paper, some of that underspend already had been included within information around our budget that we have given to members for information, and is in the paper later on that we're going to pick up in terms of our settlement. So £7.2 million has been included in our assumptions around the Loans Fund review, which will be subject to members' approval when we set our budget. We now have an extra £600,000 on top of that, which makes up that total £7.9 million. Because the decision will have to be taken in our budget at the end of February around our Loans Fund review, the change in wording doesn't prevent us from doing that, Chair, and we would be able to accept that.
Okay. I'll come back to that in just a second, but can I come to Councillor Robb?
Thank you. My question was around the impact of national insurance on the IGB. Do we have an estimate of the cost of the impact on that, and what planning is taking place to deal with that? What would the likely impact on outcomes be, or do we need to increase the budget so we've not got less outcomes for our people?
Jackie.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. The change in national insurance obviously comes in 25-26. This paper is addressing the current year's position. When I update on the paper later on in the pack, we will refer to national insurance and the impact that it has both on our own directly employed staff and how we can accommodate that. There will be implications for any employer, and that will include services that we commission to deliver for our IGB and for the council as well. That isn't something that we have been provided with funding for, and therefore that will be a pressure for the IGB in terms of commission services and also other commission services that the council makes. So that is a known risk, and ultimately if costs do go up, then it might be that services do have to be considered. But when we come to the budget paper, you'll see how we've addressed the increase for our staff. Thanks.
Okay, can I come to Alec Allison?
Don't think I'm quite awake yet, Jackie. In my simple terms then, are you saying that we cannot change this recommendation that other than £600,000 of it has already been transferred, and we cannot change that position? So we're only talking about £600,000 today. Just, I know it's probably what you've said.
No, just maybe if I phrase it another way, the full decision around the Loans Fund review still has to be made. And the figures that I've presented previously on our Loans Fund review and that feature later on in the paper, but not for decision at this stage, we had included £7.2 million of the underspend that's in here. We now have an additional £600,000 of an underspend. that this proposal was that we could consider all of that alongside the Loans Fund review. However, we haven't taken any decision on the Loans Fund review, so effectively that 7.9 million still is subject to a decision being made. And that's why the change in words that Councillor Ross suggested, to consider it as part of our future budget strategy, is still acceptable.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. So listen, so just to bring this back, I think the point has been picked up there that we're really talking about a difference in terms of what's new in this report, not of £7.9 million, but of 600,000. So in some ways, the point is not as significant as it might first appear. You've got your own assumptions, Jackie, and the finance people around how we're profiling that Loans Fund review. No decision has yet been taken on that, so we could choose to profile that differently within the realms of advice that we get from our officials. I don't have any issue then accepting the amendment that's been put forward, but I would just have to come back to this point about council tax and caution political groups around using one-off or non-recurring expenditure as a means to lean on to keep council tax down, because what you could be doing is just storing up all sorts of problems for the future. And I would draw your attention to page 47 in a future report which sets out the challenges we face over a 3-year period. And I would remind the Council always that we've got to be prudent because of the financial circumstances that we find ourselves in, because of the situation that we find ourselves in, where it's difficult to anticipate costs, but right now it's also difficult to anticipate what's happening with government grant, because there hasn't been a medium-term financial strategy now for some time. So that's my take on it, but if there are no objections, I'm happy to take the amendment from Councillor Ross. Ultimately, this is still going to be a decision for councillors to make when we set our budget. We agreed? Okay. In that case, could we, with the recommendation as amended, could we agree the report?
Agreed.
Can I come now to the item 4 on the capital paper? And can I ask Jackie to speak to that paper?
Thank you, Chair. This is our capital monitoring report, and this is also taken us to the 30th of December and includes an outturned position for our capital programme. The revised capital programme for our general fund this year is £69.8 million. That includes adjustments that have been agreed at previous executive committees. There are no adjustments proposed in this paper for committee to agree. We've also included at section 4.4 an expectation around our forecast for the year of £59 million. The forecast underspend simply reflects the timing of spend on projects, and we will carry the funding for these underspending projects into the new financial year, which will allow us to complete those projects. Our actual spend position is detailed at section 4.6. To the 30th of December, our spend had totaled £33.6 million. That leaves £25.4 million still to be incurred up until the end of the year. Our outturn information indicates that we should be able to achieve that level of expenditure. However, as we know, the storm from a couple of weeks ago would have diverted some resources to deal with that. So we will keep a close eye on our spend on our capital programme. Funding received to date is noted at 4.8. We are expecting to be able to achieve our full funding for the programme this year. Section 5 of the report picks up our housing programme. The housing capital programme is £77.2 million for this year. Funding for the year is the same as that, and it's a fully funded programme. Our forecast for the year is detailed at section 5.2. The figure in the report quotes £72.1 million. That should read £73.1 million. Apologies for that. The underspend is therefore £4.1 million, as reported at section 5.3. And that's a result of some delays in start at the sites you can see there mentioned, and that's the same as I've reported previously to committee. It also includes the fact that the average purchase price for properties purchased through the market purchase scheme has been lower than had been budgeted, reflecting the size of properties being purchased. Any funding not utilised this year will be carried forward into the new financial year. Our actual position, our actual spend position is £43.4 million for our housing programme. So if I can take you back to the recommendations, we're asking that the position for general fund and housing as at the 30th of December is noted, and that we will continue to monitor through our Financial Resources Scrutiny Forum on the programmes. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask if there are any questions in that report? And can I come to John Ross?
Yes, thanks, Chair. It's not so much a question, it's more a comment, and it may not be relevant even to this paper, but it was just to offer a huge thanks to all our council staff and employees, especially the Arbour Department, for the way that they've managed to clear the trees and debris after the last storm there. Hugely impressive. The amount of work that they've had to do has been immense. And a huge congratulations to them for the work that they've done. Thanks very much.
Okay. Are there any other questions? I don't see any. And could I suppose on behalf of the whole committee echo Councillor Ross's comments and maybe ask David that he conveys our thanks to his team? Okay. Can we agree the report? Agreed. Agreed. Come now to item 5, which is an update to funding. And back to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Chair. This is our regular report to committee on funding updates. If I just draw your attention to the appendices. In Appendix 1, you can see additional revenue funding that has been received. These are reflecting the information that I provided in the first report I presented on today. You can see additional funding for the Scottish Welfare Fund, for Ukraine refugees and the Teachers Induction Scheme. Over the page in capital, we're receiving £272,000 in relation to active travel funding, and that is planned for use at the Hare Myers project. So in terms of recommendations, we're asking that the information in the appendices be noted. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I ask if there are any questions? Could I come to John Anderson?
Thanks, Chair. It's more a comment than a question. I would like to welcome this additional fund coming from the SNP Scottish Government. I would like to especially welcome the funding for Hare Myers Station, which is a major investment from the Scottish Government, £140 million for the East Kilbride Rail Enhancement Project.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I would also like to welcome the investment in Hare Myers, and I would also like to thank all those that stood with us in forcing the Scottish Government to overturn its appalling capital cuts to that project that have allowed us to get it back on track. Okay, are there any other questions? There are none. Can we agree the report? Agreed. We are agreed. Can we come now to item 6, which is recommendations referred by the Housing and Technical Resources Committee, and I will ask Stephen Gibson to speak to this report. Stephen.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, everyone. So the purpose of this report is to seek approval for the recommendations that were approved by the Housing and Technical Resource Committee when they met on the 22nd of January. The report summarised the revenue assumptions for HRA in 2025-26 and requested approval for the proposed rent increase and capital programme for the year commencing the 1st of April. The background, as usual, is in section 3, and I'll just go over that quickly. As you'd expect, a summary of the proposal for HRA business plan and the capital programme for next year were set out. And as usual, the report confirms that the HRA budget for next year is informed by a robust 30-year business plan. Moving on to the rent increase itself, following consultation with tenants, the report proposed a multi-year agreement in relation to the rent increase, advised a rent increase of 6.5% for 2025-26, with a further 6.5% increase in 26-27. And just to restate that, although a multi-year agreement is being proposed in line with discussions with tenants last year, it's important to stress that we'll still be engaging with tenants this year on the basis of the annual increase, and we'll still be seeking approval from elected members before setting the rent next year. In terms of the capital programme and our priorities, the report seeks approval for a capital programme of £85.948 million. A report clarifies our investment priorities through this programme will be to maintain and improve our existing stock, to meet national quality and energy efficiency standards, to continue our new build programme and continue the programme of environmental works which have been ongoing for some time. In terms of the affordable housing programme, the report advises that the Housing and Technical Resource Committee noted there's a 44% increase in the national budget and compared to last year. We still don't know how that's going to filter down to South Lanarkshire, and we're waiting to see how that's going to transition into a programme for South Lanarkshire Council, but we'll keep you updated on that. Moving on to the consultation arrangements, the report to the Housing and Technical Resource Committee summarised the approach that we took in advance of proposing a 6.5% increase. And following a similar approach to previous years, we engaged closely with the Budget Scrutiny Group and a Tenant Participation Coordination Group, who do an awful lot of work for us, and on behalf of everyone here, we'd really like to thank them for everything they do and for all their input. The report confirmed that they supported the proposals for the multi-year rent increase with an annual review. Moving on, there are no real employee implications that weren't or financial implications that weren't discussed in that report, and as were the climate change and sustainability implications. So if we could take you back to the recommendations, the report comes with 2 recommendations. Firstly, that the rent increase of 6.5% is applied for 2025-26, with a further 6.5% increase in 2026-27, and that this is subject to an annual review, and customer engagement will be endorsed and customer engagement, and the request that this should be endorsed and referred to full council for approval. And secondly, that based on the proposed increase of 6.5%, the Housing Capital Programme of £85.948 million for 25-26 be endorsed and referred to full council for approval. Thanks very much. Happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Can I ask if there are any questions? Could you indicate now, and I will come to Andrea Cowan.
Thanks. Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Stephen. I know we've already been through this report at Housing, so I don't really have any. Detailed questions. I'd like to first of all welcome that we've got an additional £8.7 million this year for housing HRA as opposed to last year's spend. So that's always welcome. And the 6.5 increase in the rent, I know that obviously that's pre-agreed, if you like, and it still keeps us amongst the lowest rents in the country, which is also good. The only slight negative that I would like to put in is that I understand that the additional national insurance contribution is going to cost the HRA £300,000. And if you could just maybe confirm for me that the way the HRA is funded, it actually, doesn't matter how much money is given from any government to support that additional cost. This will always have to come out of the HRA account, and therefore it looks to me as though our tenants are having to pay the additional national insurance contribution.
Thank you. Yeah, you're correct. In terms of how housing revenue accounts are funded, they're effectively funded from tenants' rents. So any increase in cost, be it national insurance or be it elsewhere, would be a cost that would fall to the housing revenue account. In the paper that I'm just coming to, I'll explain around what funding the council is getting around national insurance.
Yeah.
But
that won't affect the HRA. It will still be our tenants that foot that bill. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Could I come to Kirsten Robb?
Thank you. Just to thank all the staff for all the work they've been doing on the storm issues that have happened, lots of issues with the housing. Considering we're going to have more increased frequency of storms and the severity of storms, how are we building that risk into the perhaps increasing costs for maintenance and increasing the resilience of our properties to cope with climate change?
Thanks very much. Next question. Yeah. It's something that we considered. We have our own resource risk management schedules. We have corporate risk management schedules. Climate change and the impact of climate change is something that's considered at a resource level, at a service level and at a corporate level. So we're very, very cited on this, and it's something thinking about the future provision of services and the type of housing we're building. It's all factored in.
Okay. Thank you very much. Just want to highlight that return to the point that Stephen has made, that this has been pre-agreed and is subject to annual review, and those additional costs have been absorbed within the budget that we've made available. And I would also make the point that we are making clear as through COSLA our concerns about the national insurance position, but I would also make the point that there has been a substantial fiscal expansion as a result of the UK budget, and that is filtering down into public services. I would like to see more of it come to public services, but that will be a debate for another day as the Scottish budget works its way through the Parliament. In terms of the recommendations within the report, can I ask if we can agree the recommendations? Councillor Ross?
Yeah, Joe, just come back on your last comment there. Regardless of what you just said, national insurance contributions are costing the general public an awful lot more simply because of decisions made at Westminster. Thanks very much.
National insurance contributions have gone up for employers, not for employees. And I will reiterate my point about the concerns I have about the rise, but I would say to Councillor Ross that it's been a long time waiting for a fiscal expansion and an austerity-busting budget, and I welcome the fact that we've finally got one. In terms of the recommendations, are we agreed? Agreed. We're agreed. Let's move on to the next item, which is item 7, the 25-26 revenue budget gap and savings and update following the settlement. Again, come back to Jackie Taylor. Jackie.
Thank you, Chair. This report updates committee on our budget gap and savings targets for next financial year following the receipt of our settlement in December. What this paper will do is I'll provide a bit of a recap on the budget position that I presented back in November to committee, and then also update on what the settlement means for that budget and budget gap. I'll also pick up in relation to council tax and also on our capital grant position that was also notified to us as part of our settlement. So if I can take you to section 4 of the report on page 44, just in terms of a recap of the position that I had reported back in November. And if I focus on table 1, in section 4.1, this was the position that you had heard back then. Basically, what I was shown here was over each of the next 3 financial years, a total budget gap of £77.2 million, which was the base budget gap that I'd reported back in June. We had reported that we expected less spend around utilities and a higher level of council tax collection, which allowed us to reduce that 3-year budget gap to £71.4 million. Back in November, I had presented a pack of savings for members' consideration, and this table illustrates that if all of those savings of £10.6 million had been agreed, and the proposals around loans fund had also been agreed, then that total budget gap over the 3 years would be £31.5 million. And as I say, we were illustrating the position over the 3 years of that strategy for information. Section 5 updates members on what the settlement that we received in December means for that budget gap. When we look at our settlement for next financial year, comparing year on year, our grants, a like-for-like increase of £22.6 million was apparent. We had assumed within our budget strategy that we would actually see a reduction in our grant of £1.6 million. So taking those things together, we actually see a benefit on our budget of £24.2 million. But there are other budget considerations that we have to make when looking at our budget, and they're covered from section 5.4 onwards. The first of those at section 5.5 is in relation to national insurance contributions. We expect the costs for the council for our directly employed staff to be around £15.4 million. And at the time of writing this report, we hadn't been given information on what funding we could expect to receive. We were anticipating that that could mean that we could see a shortfall in the funding around national insurance of £8 million. Therefore, it's prudent to build into our budget position an assumption that we will have to cover those costs. I'll come back at the end of this section with an update that we've received since this report was written. Section 5.6 of the report then picks up teacher numbers. I've been reporting to you for a while around the uncertainties around our requirements to maintain teacher numbers. We know that we had a reduction in 2024 in our teacher numbers and believe we have strong mitigations in place for that. We're still uncertain as to whether there's an expectation that we will restore our teacher numbers to the 2023 levels, which has been indicated by the government. If we had to do that, that would be at a cost of £4.2 million to the council. 5.7 does report, though, that we did receive more money as part of our settlement for maintenance of teacher numbers, and that was £2.6 million. That reflects the fact that a teacher now costs more than it did when funding was previously provided for teachers. £2.6 million, therefore, is a gain towards our budget gap position. But just picking up the overall position around teacher numbers, at 5.8, I'm reporting around our assumptions at 5.6 may be impacted by the fact that there are discussions ongoing around class contact time. So that's the amount of time that a teacher is expected to be in front of a classroom. As part of the 25-26 budget discussions, the government were looking for a meaningful discussion around reducing class contact time. Now, depending on any agreements that are reached and the timing around that, the extra costs to the council of reducing class contact time could be £5.3 million in order for us to bring additional teachers into the system to cover that reduced class contact time. Therefore, the extra funds that we've included within this proposal at section 5.6, that £4.2 million to restore teacher numbers, could be required to meet the extra teachers that would be required for class contact, and we would require to add a further £1.1 million into the budget, albeit that would be in later years, expected to be around about 27-28. It would mean then that our mitigations for not restoring teacher numbers, whilst would still be valid, would be superseded by the requirement to bring in more teachers for class contact time. On page 46 at 5.10, we're reporting about additional funding that has been received for additional support for learning. We expect to receive 1.6 million of that. It hasn't yet been distributed. However, we do believe that that extra funding will come with additional requirements to spend that money specifically on augmenting our ASL provision. Therefore, there's no benefit to the budget strategy for that. And at 5.11 and around our pay award assumptions, it's felt prudent to consider the amount that we've assumed within our budget strategy for pay award for 25-26 in order for us to look to contribute towards early agreement on the pay award for 25-26, and also reflecting at this point it's uncertain whether any additional funding would be forthcoming to meet a local government pay award, as has happened in previous years. Therefore, we are proposing to augment the assumptions that we have within our budget strategy for the 25-26 pay award to the tune of £5.9 million. And finally, around budget issues, at 5.12, we're discussing the grant assumptions for future years. Our budget strategy had assumed a grant increase of £5.8 million in 26-27, and that was based on a spending review that was published in 2022, and an expectation that an additional £100 million would be included in the government settlement in 26-27. As we've had a better than anticipated settlement in 25-26, it may mean that we won't get that additional grant increase that we initially expected in 26-27, and additional funds are actually being front-loaded into 25-26. Therefore, I'd recommend that it's no longer prudent to assume that we will see that increase, and as a result, our budget gap for 26-27 would increase by £5.8 million. I've summarised the position at 5.13 around what that settlement then means for us as a council in terms of our budget gaps. And there's a recurring benefit that we can see from the settlement that we received of £2.8 million. And again, I'll come back to that figure in a second. Now, all of the budget issues that I've identified relate to 25-26, with the exception of that grant assumption that I mentioned a second ago, and that's in relation to our 26-27 financial year. Therefore, there'd be the ability on a one-off basis to use £5.8 million of budget without impacting on the overall budget gap. So to try and summarise for you, at section 6 and at table 3, I've presented what the revised budget gap now looks like after that settlement. The previous report that the previous table that I talked about first was a report that showed what our budget gap could look like if all of our savings that were presented at that time were accepted. And table 2 of the report shows that there is a £2.8 million recurring benefit from the settlement that we received in December. So pulling that together, table 3 now tries to reflect an updated position on our budget gap, and taking into account that benefit of settlement. But at this stage, as we know, no decisions have been taken around savings. So this table reflects our budget gap before any savings are taken. And you can see there that the revised budget gap position after taking into account the settlement is £39.3 million over the 3 years detailed there. This does include the proposals that have been made around loans fund review and that will still be subject to members' decision when we consider our budget later on in February. So the total budget gap of £39.3 million, and I can also show in 25-26 that our budget gap before savings and council tax would be £6.997 million. Section 6.3 of the report again just reminds us that because of the position around our assumptions on grant for 26-27, that we would also have the benefit of £5.8 million on a one-off basis for 25-26. Section 6.4 reminds us that we haven't yet included any assumptions around council tax in that position that we're reporting for 25-26. Taking you over to page 48, 6.5 just again illustrates the amount of underspend that I reported earlier in the meeting that is also available for consideration on a one-off basis in 25-26, and that's that 5.8 million underspend that I referred to earlier. Also picking up at 6.6, in relation to the Lanarkshire Valuation Joint Board, as part of their budget setting for next year, they are aware that they have additional reserves that they were not expecting to have, and therefore the Council's contribution to the Valuation Joint Board has reduced for next financial year only by the tune of £282,000. That means that the budget that the Council has for the Valuation Joint Board contribution has £282,000 that is available for members to consider the use of on a one-off basis as they consider the overall budget position. Section 6.7 of the report picks up the packaging extender producer responsibility requirements. This is where it's expected that the costs associated with managing and disposal of household packaging will shift from the public purse to providers. We have received correspondence from DEFRA which indicates an estimated amount of funding that could be coming to the Council next financial year. However, there are uncertainties around how the scheme will operate, the value of funding that we will actually receive, and what is expected from us in 25-26 in the way of expenditure. So therefore, due to this uncertainty, it's deemed prudent at this point in time we don't include this indicative sum at this point in budget considerations, and we'll report back to members in due course when there are more certainties around that. Section 7 of the report just picks up information that I've provided before to members around council tax. The figures that I've presented in the paper today don't include any assumptions around council tax. We know that every 1% increase in our Band D council tax would generate £1.6 million, which could contribute towards budget gaps, and it could contribute towards that 3-year budget gap of £39.3 million. And a reminder at 7.2 that the Council currently has the lowest level of Band D council tax in mainland Scotland. All of the information that I've presented here today in relation to our 25-26 budget will be consolidated into the officer's paper that members will be asked to consider at the budget meeting on the 26th of February. I mentioned earlier on that I would come back to that recurring benefit from the settlement that's detailed in Table 2, and that was £2.858 million. Since writing this report, we have had more information around the funding that is likely to be made available around national insurance, and we believe that we will actually perhaps be able to adjust that figure by up to £900,000. That budget benefit that we get from our settlement to the tune of £900,000. And also through the process that we go through to check the settlement, we've also had indication that we may see a further £800,000 of benefit as that settlement checking process goes through its normal process. Therefore, that recurring benefit of £2.858 million that I mentioned in Table 2 actually is now estimated to be £4.5 million. And again, that will be reflected in the budget papers that are taken to Council on the 26th of February. Now, that was the revenue position. The capital position is picked up in Section 8. We are in receipt of a general capital grant of £22.8 million for 25-26. There are some funds that had still to be allocated, and that includes £40 million for climate emergency funding and funding in relation to flood prevention. We will pull together for members' consideration a proposed capital programme for that meeting of the Council on the 26th of February, and that will hopefully start to tease out some of the information around the climate emergency funding, particularly the Council's allocation. A summary is provided at section 9, which just summarises the information I've presented to you today. And in terms of timeline, as I mentioned a couple of times, the position on the budget, including capital, will be brought back to the Council meeting on the 26th of February for agreement. So in terms of recommendations, this is a report for noting, so we're asking that the update to the budget strategy and the revised 3-year budget gap of £39.3 million be noted. The position in relation to council tax and capital grant are also noted, and also the timeline. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Jackie. That is quite an extensive report, and I know we'll see a further iteration of it as we come to the budget. Can I ask if there are any questions you might want to indicate now? I think our screen's just come back. You're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way for a minute there, but I'll come to Robert Brown.
Thanks very much. I'm amazed. Thanks for the report, Jackie, which is a very complex arrangement. I'm amazed at the ability to, if you like, vanish the local government settlement from 22 million down to next to nothing. It's quite an amazing feat, but it's gone back up a weird. The point I wanted to make, though, more seriously, was on the teacher numbers thing, and it's really just an observation that it seems to me quite ridiculous that we are still, after really a couple of years or more of actually agitating about teacher numbers, still left with uncertainty on this matter. You can have all sorts of views about the relevant levels of teacher numbers and classroom staff and all of that sort of thing that goes with it. But for the councils at this point in setting budgets, not to know what the arrangements are for teachers, what are required for them in precise terms, and what the funding implication of it is quite unnecessary and quite ridiculous in my view. It's just an observation. I'm not really looking for comment on it, but it does give us a problem we could do without on the fringe of the budget.
I agree, and all I would say is that this has been subject of continued discussion in other forums. Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think we just note the report. Agree to note the report. Okay. I'll come now to item 8, which is an update on the National Care Service, and can come back to Jackie. No, sorry, I won't come back to Jackie. It's the force of habit today. Sorry, there's a lot of finance papers today. Suman, could I come to you? Okay.
Good morning. Unfortunately, my dulcet tones aren't as good as Jackie's. Thank you very much, Chair. This is the report that members will have recall we've brought to previous meetings of the Executive Committee to provide an update on the progress of the National Care Service Bill that's been taken through by the Scottish Government. Within the paper in front of you then, it highlights a key change that's been announced by the Scottish Government in terms of Section 1, Part 1, of the bill having been put to one side, and the Government's intention to proceed with Parts 2 and 3. A paper has been taken to causal leaders, asking for a view in terms of the advisory, i.e. non-statutory or non-legislative arrangements that are being suggested in terms of a national oversight body. The leader might want to comment on that, but other than that, I would take you back to the recommendations under 2.1 and happy to answer any questions if I can. Thank you.
Okay, are there any questions on this paper? Can I come to Robert Brown?
Yes, thanks very much. It's becoming almost traditional that I have a rant on the National Care Service, and this is no exception. It's very good news, I think, that the government have at last bowed to reality on this matter and excluded the takeover, if you like, of the care services from their arrangements going forward. I think everyone has always accepted that there were issues to do with workforce planning and standards and things of that kind that were appropriate for national level decision making, and hopefully there can be a bit of focus on that one. I wanted, though, to ask about the financial implications. This abortive exercise has already cost the National Exchequer something of the order of £30 million. There was talk in the Scottish Parliament committee reports about a cost, if the whole thing had gone through, bringing it in of 1.4 billion thereafter, on a rising schedule as well. And I just wondered if there was any indication that the government were going to reallocate any funding towards what remains a hard-pressed local care service that we have to deal with in terms of constituent inquiries and so forth locally.
Okay, Suman.
So we've had no indication that actually monies had been set aside for covering the costs around it. The numbers you've quoted were highlighted through the committee process and then had been revised downwards by government through as the bill had been progressing in terms of the draft financial memorandum. So as I'm aware, there's not a separate resource that's been identified that would then be made available. As I've indicated within the report under Section 6, though, as Audit Scotland have highlighted, IGBs in terms of adult health and social care are already projecting a quite significant recurrent deficit. That's been the case for some time now, and that is worsening. Certainly I know in terms of my counterparts, we're currently doing a piece of work to aggregate the projected deficits for 25-26 onwards that we will be sharing with COSLA and indeed Scottish Government over the coming weeks in respect of that. But as you've identified, there's already significant pressures within the system, and that has consequences for the people we provide services to, and it provides greater levels of uncertainty for our staff and indeed the staff of our partners. And that would speak to Councillor Robb's question earlier on as well in terms of the position in terms of national insurance contributions, because the position articulated by Audit Scotland within its report that I referred to within the report was prior to the announcement about the ENIX changes. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It makes the point, I think, that we remain in a position where local care services are under-resourced and still need additional funding going into them going forward. And that, our hope is going to be a kind of refocused initiative by everybody concerned, by COSLA, by the government, to try and do something a bit better in this particular field. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Could I come to Councillor Walker?
Thanks, Chair. Just further to what Suman was saying, we recently met with Jackie Bailey, all the IGB sort of chairs and deputies, and that situation is reflected around Scotland, some of the serious budget deficits that are being faced and some of the really harmful cuts that have been made and are going to continue over this year and next year. So although there was actually additional monies, and I think it was £2 billion, that was identified as additional funding for health and social care. It's not the case, unfortunately, that it's managing to actually reach the kind of frontline services and the current crisis. And some of that is around, obviously, Suman knows better than me, you know, overpromising in relation to salaries, etc. And also there is an issue that some of the money, for example, hospital at home, is actually going direct to the NHS rather than coming down to social care. So some of the boards aren't actually getting access to some of that money, and that's something that we maybe have to look at a wee bit more closely, because obviously social care and how social care interacts with that is really crucial in terms of the whole delayed discharge issue and accident emergency and all of it. So that's maybe something that we can look at more of that money or advocate for some more of that money to come to local authorities. I know we are having a session tomorrow afternoon, so we hope we can maybe go into some of that, and also the issues in relation to the national insurance contributions. But I know that there has been a decision that the health and social care staff will be supported in that, but in terms of the commissioning services, I don't think that's the case. So hopefully we can have a discussion about how that's going to impact in terms of the budget. In relation to the National Care Service, I mean, my views on how that's been conducted are well known. There has been calls, I know that there was quite a hefty article in the Glasgow Herald the other week, people, some of the voluntary sector organisations calling for actually the Audit Commission to carry out an inquiry into the whole process. In terms of how the consultation was carried out, the fact that really no notice time after time was taken, what was said by the wide range of organisations that were consulted, and seemed to be, for most of it, their comments completely ignored, and the chaos and waste of time that created. And of course, most importantly, the money that was wasted. I mean, my own view is there should be an inquiry. There absolutely should be an inquiry from the Audit Commission so that we can look at the findings and hopefully learn the lessons. I also hope, if we're moving forward with this, which we seem to be, that the Scottish Government will have taken note of the vast amount of information and responses and suggestions from people who know what they're talking about, in relation to how actually to tackle the current crisis in social care and health. I hope that they take notice of it this time and they come up with something that will in fact make a difference to people who are dependent on and need social care and NHS services, and that we don't waste any more of the of people's money and time in terms of producing nothing at the end of it. Thanks, Chair. Okay.
To the extent there are questions in there, I'm just, are there any points that you want to come back on there, Suman? Because there are a lot of points that have been made, but I won't ask you to comment on the political points.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Walker. So the area I would just hone in on is your starting observation in terms of the propositions that come through from the government around extra funding. So, as you've identified, in terms of the circa 200 million that was talked about nationally in terms of health and social care, actually all of that was around healthcare, i.e. NHS areas of expenditure, including that relates to delayed discharge. So as you noted, there was a number of areas of spend in there in particular that are related to hospital home, which is obviously an NHS service, and a number of other areas. So predominantly that will have tied into waiting time initiatives as well as additional capacity to support our hospitals, as well as some additional activity within our community spaces. There are some elements in there to do with funding for short breaks, but nothing substantive in terms of additional funding for either care at home services, whether they're delivered, for example, in-house or indeed through external providers.
Okay. I don't see any other questions, so can I bring us back to the recommendations? Can we agree to note the report? We're agreed. There are no items of urgent business, so can I bring the meeting now to a close, and thank you for your attendance. Thank you.